Good evening, family. Good evening. Getting ready to jump into tonight's Bible study. Grateful for the opportunity to connect again. It's been a minute. Uh, 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 Thankful that all of us were able to make it through the storm and just the fantastic ways that God showed Himself faithful on our behalf. And and glad to kind of get it in tonight. Just a quick perusal of 1 Samuel chapter 1. And for those of you that are going to be following along, it's 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 10 and 11, and then chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. As you know, this year we are doing a survey of the Old Testament. And we're now in First Samuel, and in First Samuel, the first part of First Samuel, we get an opportunity to take a look at um, the life of one of my favorite biblical characters, Hannah. Hannah's name means grace. Hannah is married to a brother by the name of Elkanah and Elkanah. They live in the city of Ephraim, a little hillside town just north of Jerusalem. Now, if you turn over to First Samuel chapter 10, excuse me, First Samuel chapter 1, verses 10 through 11, chapters 2, chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, and if you were to take um, a view of Hannah's life from the street, if you and I were just to peek and look into her window, uh, from the outside looking in, Hannah looks like it appears as though she has an ideal life. She's got a um, beautiful home, a husband that loves her. She's surrounded by friends and family. But Hannah, just like all of us, Hannah has problems. She has, in fact, quite a few problems. Hannah has problems in her world. If you do a little bit of background in the time of just a background study of the times that Hannah lived in, it was a very tumultuous time in the history of the Hebrew people. This is the period just after the judges and just prior to the advent of the kings. And during this time, the people are wilding. That they are doing whatever, with the way that the scriptures describe it, is that everyone was doing what was right in their own mind or in their own sight. The people of God were rejecting the word of God. They had no respect for the books of the law, the report of Moses, um, and it was a very difficult spiritual climate, and it was the kind of situation that one would maybe even question, is this the kind of environment that I want to have a family in, that I want to raise children in? She lived in a very difficult time, not too unlike the times that we live in now as well, where we live in a period where people reject the authority and sovereignty of God. People have no sense of um, spiritual connection to God. Or there's a kind of spiritual um, acknowledgement of God, but as uh, one writer says, but denying the power of God therein. Um, and so much that we see going on in our society is also reflected in the times um, that Hannah lived in addition to sort of the spiritual atrophy that was all around her. There was also a tremendous amount of political turmoil because the Hebrews had no real national government, no organized or formal system for making sure that needs were met, or even to raise an army in the event of an attack. They were constantly under threat from what was their regional opponent, the Philistines, who would come in, take what they wanted, and if something didn't change, eventually they would cease to be a people. They would not be able to have or to inhabit the land. And so it was in the midst of this kind of problematic scene that Hannah, um, married to Elkanah, is trying to navigate and find her way. In addition to having problems in her world, Hannah also had problems in her own home. Her husband, Elkanah, had a second wife, uh, Penina, which translates to mean pearl. And Penina was anything but a pearl. She was vicious. Um, Now, I do want to say very quickly, the Old Testament, even though in the Old Testament we see polygamy practiced, it was not something that was ever um, endorsed in Scripture. This was a choice or a decision that men made of their own volition. And it was as messy as you can imagine. It was as messy as trying to have, someone on the side, or trying to have multiple partners. There's all kinds of human emotions that get involved that make things very, very uncomfortable, to say the least. And so here it is. You have Hannah and Penina, who are sharing the same man. And of course, there's a bitter rivalry that forms. In addition to just the natural rivalry that occurs between paramours, there was also this additional tension because Hannah was unable to have children. And Penina was a baby making factory. The scriptures talk about in verse number 4 all of her sons and her daughters. And because Penina was, petty, and who isn't petty, right, in a romantic rivalry? She's rubbing that constantly in Hannah's face every opportunity that she gets. As a matter of fact, in chapter 1 and verse number 6, it says that she provoked Hannah bitterly and irritated her because the Lord had closed her womb. And again, the things that we see that Hannah was experiencing in terms of these problems in her home are not unlike some of the problems that we see that are persistent in the culture that we live in now. I was reading a stat the other day that says 1 in 3 marriages end in divorce. We see things like suicide on the rise across the generations, especially in the lives of our children. And it's not all that surprising, right? When we think about the climate and the culture that our children are trying to navigate, where they have all of these academic pressures. We have them involved in everything from ping pong to kung fu. There's athletics and trying to perform, and some with hopes of a scholarship or superstardom, and just the constant weight of just busyness that children have to navigate. Um, and in many cases, while they are learning or being made responsible for all of these different things, some of them, don't even know how to pray or talk to God, or even have any sense of what their deeper purpose may be, as it relates to how their Creator has designed them. And these are the kinds of pressures that Hannah was under, the kind of pressures and things that she and her family were facing. Again, not that dissimilar from the kinds of things that you and I are facing today. Not only did Hannah have problems in her community, not only did Hannah have problems in her home, But we also see that Hannah had problems in her church. And technically it's a house of worship. It's not a church in the strictest sense, but in the sense that church means the gathering, right? The gathering of people who love God, who come together to worship, praise God, to study the scriptures together, to have community, right? Spiritual community, a community of faith. Um, Even here, Hannah could not find any relief. Annually, she and her family would go up for the feast of the Thanksgiving, is what most believe. And when they would get there, this feast was being led by the sons of Eli. Right, Eli was a priest there. His sons were being trained or raised up as priests, and these guys were crooks. They were stealing from the house of worship and also sleeping with some of the women that work there in this synagogue. And this is the place where Hannah is going to try and find an escape from her hectic life, to maybe experience some calm in the midst of her storm. But we look at chapter 2, verses 22 through 34, and we see that in this place that ought to be a refuge, uh, she finds more problems. Now, I want to say, even in our context, right, we navigate some of those same issues. Now, let me say right off top, I believe in the church. I value the church, uh, you know, not just theoretically, but also personally. The church, throughout the course of my life and development, has been a blessing to me. It has. Uh, I've witnessed the church be a meter of needs. It has met needs that I've had. I've seen it meet the needs of so many others around me. Being a part of the church community has drawn me closer to God. I've seen church draw others closer to God. Church has been a stabilizing force in my marriage. Church and being a part of church culture has helped to shape the kind of father I am, and the kind of investments that I seek to make in the life of my child. Also, I've seen church do the same thing for my own parents and for my own father, and equip him to be the kind of father that me and my siblings needed, and to see the way that he has shown up for us, as God has shown up in him. Um, Church has been the place where I've been able to find my peer group. It's a place where my wife has found a peer group, a place where my daughter has found her peer group and formed lasting, lifetime friendships. And one of the things we like to talk about at New Hope is where you come and you arrive as a stranger, um, and then you become, where you meet friends, and then friends eventually become family. Church has been the place where I have learned, and many of my core values and the things that have helped me to navigate life and business and secular relationships on secular jobs, relationships out in the community with people who are non-believers. Church has been the thing that has linked me and my family to the larger family of God. So I am a believer in the church. I'm a believer in the ecclesia, the called out ones, the gathering of those who love God and love His appearing. However, and someone was sharing a story once about this minister, Pierce Harris, uh, who one time Pastor Harris went into a prison, as a part of his prison ministry, to share a sermon, and one of the inmates was selected to introduce him, and the inmate stood and he said, I want to tell you about a friend of mine. We grew up together. We fished together. We went to Sunday school together. We went to church together. And then as we got older, I, you know, I went in a different direction. My friend, he kept going to Sunday school. He kept being a part of what was going on at the church. He says, and so, as he comes to the end of the introduction, he says, so, it's probably not hard for you to guess who my friend is, I want to introduce you to my friend, Pastor Pierce. Uh, I have seen the church save me and save so many of those that I know and love from a life uh, that would have been fruitless and that would have been painful and led to all kinds of choices that were basically dead end streets. It was the church that helped pull me out of a spiral, a death spiral. And I've seen that be true of so many other men in my circle of friends. But with that being said, I also know that the church can hurt people. I know that the church can hurt people. The church hurt my mother. When we first moved back here from South Carolina, and my mother started, attending this little small Pentecostal house church. And I can remember, we were going to this church and, giving our tithe, giving our money, going and praying and getting the word. And then, I looked up and we weren't going there anymore. And I asked my mom kind of what happened. And the dude had run off with the money. You know what I'm saying? The church, I know that the church can hurt people. I know that the church hurts people when they're in deep grief, and people, throw around cliches, I've heard people say, well, you know what, well, I'm, well, even though your child is dead, thank God that your child is with God. It's like, um, while that may be true, who in that moment, who wants to hear that? Like in that moment, I don't need you to try and help me to rationalize the pain that I'm in because someone significant to me is no longer here and present. In that moment, maybe what I need you to do is just be present and maybe offer a shoulder to cry on, right? The church, the church can and does hurt people. It hurts people when we try to force easy solutions on people when they're dealing with deep problems. I've heard people say, well, well, you just gotta, the issue is you just gotta get saved, or the problem is you're not spiritual enough, or you're not spirit filled enough. And kind of like the same way that Job, if you look at the book of Job, and when Job was going through all of the painful things that he was experiencing, and these friends, these religious friends came along and were assuming that the things that were happening to him were because of some deficiency on his part. The church hurts people. The church hurts people when the church is fighting. When churches fight, people get hurt. Heard a story one time, a famous story about Pastor W.A. Criswell, um, and how when God called him to pastor, uh, he put buried his face in his hands and just began to weep because all he could think about was his pastor growing up in this little small Oklahoma city, this small Oklahoma country church that he attended, and how pastor after pastor would come to that church and be abused by the congregation. Um, the church can and does hurt people, but that does not drive me away from the church. If anything, it drives me to work to make sure that our congregation is a place where people come to get, to heal hurts, to meet needs, and to lift Christ. It doesn't drive me away from the church. It drives me to be mission focused and purpose driven, um, because I believe that the church is the vehicle that God has left on the earth to help bring people into the kingdom. And so, with all of the problems that Hannah has, right? Problems in her community, problems in her home, problems in her church. Hannah's probably her biggest problem is Hannah's problem with herself. Hannah has an internal problem. When you start to read Hannah's story, throughout the story, throughout the context of her struggle. Hannah is whiny. She complains a lot. She is miserable. And she makes everyone around her equally miserable. She is, I heard one minister say she is both childless and childish. Um, when you think about it, Hannah had a home. She had a husband that was a good provider. She had a husband that loved her immensely. Uh, we can assume that Hannah had a loving community around her, friends and family. But all Hannah could think about was what she didn't have. With everything that Hannah had in her life, the only thing that she could think about was what she didn't have. And as a result of that, she made herself miserable. She made her husband miserable. And all of the people that were connected to her, she made them miserable because she was stuck in that place of I could be happy if only, right? And that can sometimes be a challenge for any of us. For any of us. Sometimes the enemy of our peace is a spirit of ingratitude. If only my car was a little nicer, if only my house was a little bigger, if only I was a little taller, if only I had a little bit more money. And oftentimes, what is tragic is we are delaying joy, we are delaying peace because we're wishing for a life that doesn't necessarily equate to contentment or to peace. How many times have we said, "Well, Lord, if I just had a better paying job," and then you get the better paying job, then it's, "Well, Lord, if I only just had a bigger house," and then you get the bigger house, and then it's like, "Oh, well, Lord, if I only, if you know," and when our sense of contentment and peace is rooted in, it is predicated upon people and things, then our internal contentment and peace will always be at the mercy of our circumstances. Our peace, our internal contentment will fluctuate based on the conditions around us. And really what is interesting about Hannah's life is that she at some point seems to get it, right? It clicks for her. We see where um, she gets ready in chapter 1, verse 15, to go up to Shiloh, to the house of worship, just like she always does, right? This is an annual event. They make the trip to Shiloh, and all of the usual suspects are there. Her husband is there. The other wife, she's there with I just in my mind I imagine these irritating, bratty little kids, right? Just as you know, maybe they weren't, but I'm just in my mind, right? And so, and there she is, with this sarcastic lady making all kinds of snide and rude comments, and they're going there and they're on their way to the house of worship again, but this time something is different. Something in Hannah shifts, and rather than kind of whining and complaining, she instead goes to God in prayer. And I mean, with a kind of intensity that maybe, has been there somewhat previously, but for some reason it just hits differently. And and this time around, she finds God in church. Um, she's crushed by Panina's, that irritating laugh and just and picking at her. Uh, Hannah's unable to eat. And though in verse number 15, it says she went into the house of worship. She sat close to Eli the priest, and she poured her soul out to God. She just cried out to God, and God stepped in, and he used Eli. Now mind you, he used the preacher Eli. Now Eli is an interesting character. We could do a whole Bible study on Eli, but he used Eli, a preacher who couldn't control his own children, right? Who didn't have a clue about what was going on in Hannah's life. And God used Eli to speak a word over Hannah. If you look at chapter 1, verse 11, chapter 1, verse 11 gives you sort of the content of Hannah's prayer. She prayed that God would give her a boy. She made promises to God that if God blessed her with a boy, she would make sure that she raised him up in the fear of the Lord, in the Nazarite tradition, that she would make sure that he would be a young man that would walk with God and that would trust God. All of the things that she knew would be consistent with God's will for her parenting. And there's again something to be said in that, in terms of what do we aspire to be as parents for our children? What are the hopes, dreams, and aspirations that we hold for our children? Do we want to see them be wealthy? Do we want to see them be famous or well known or well regarded? Um, but at the heart of it, do we want to see them have a relationship with their Creator, to know their ultimate purpose, to walk humbly with their God, and to know that God in due season will elevate them at the proper time? There's a few things I want to say about Coach Prime. Um, go Buffaloes! But there's something about the way the brother carries himself. A lot of confidence, but always careful to talk about the role that God has played both in his development and also his elevation. Is that what we desire for our children? Well, be intentional in your prayers, even as you're talking to God about what you hope for your children, what you hope your children aspire to. Be intentional in the conversations that you have with God. And in verses 12 through 18, as she's praying, it's kind of an internal prayer, right? When Eli sees her praying, he doesn't hear anything. He just sees her lips moving. And this is how disconnected Eli is. Eli sees the lady praying, sees her lips moving, and he assumes that she's drunk, right? She is so fervent in her prayers, so passionate, so intense that he misreads the situation and thinks that the lady has been drinking. And God uses this man. He uses Eli, again, a man who some might question his fathering skills. Someone who is not able to discern the move of God on a woman's life, and God uses Eli. I thank God all the time for using the unqualified, for using us in spite of ourselves sometimes, right? In spite of our foibles, our shortcomings, and just um, our imperfections. And so God uses Eli, and Eli questions her, and Hannah breaks down for him what is happening, her state, her condition, why it is that she is so intense in her worship. And when Eli hears what's going on, he says to her, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your request." Chapter 1, verse number 17. And it says that after Eli made this declaration over her life, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your request," it says that her face was sad no more. In other words, Hannah experienced the peace of God even before she received the blessing of God. Why? Because in that moment, what Hannah needed most was to let it go to let go and to let God, to let it go and let God have his way. I mean, again, a cliche, right? But in so many instances, when you and I are able to take the really hard stuff that we sometimes carry with us, and rather than let it rest on us in a way that um, embitters us, um, surfaces a sense of ingratitude, blocks our ability to be able to see all of the other ways that God is keeping us and blessing us. It is a joy to the soul to be able to take some of those heavy things and to cast your burdens upon the Lord, and know that the Lord cares for you. When Hannah is able to give that thing over to God, and the man of God, Eli, is able to affirm to her, listen, God has been with you in this space. Um, you know, it then allows what Paul says would happen. It allows the peace of God that surpasses all understanding to guard her heart and her mind. Even tonight, I want to encourage somebody through Hannah's story. There are so many hard things that we are navigating, just like Hannah. Hard things that are going on in our world, from the political climate to things that happen just right here in our neighborhoods, things that are conflicts that we see our children in, conflicts that we see happening between parents and their children. Just so many ugly things that we get exposed to on a regular basis. Not to mention the struggle that many have within the context of their own home, where we see the hand of the enemy busy in the context of marriages. We see the hand of the enemy busy just in terms of the way that the financial system is set up, and the injustices and the lack of equity that we see, even in the way that corporations and um, businesses handle their employees, and just all of the challenges that we see people and that we are navigating in the community, in our homes, um, that in the face of sometimes what can feel like overwhelming odds, challenges that we're facing within some of our churches, our church and believing communities, that in the face of all of those things, um, God is in many ways calling us to trust Him like never before. In the same way that Hannah, in the face of loss after loss, continued every year to make her way to Shiloh. Every year she made her way to Shiloh, in spite of the burdens, in spite of the challenges and the difficulties. She looked to God. Um, and I'll say this on my way out the door. I, you know, I'm in the interest of total transparency. I'm the type of person where I'm constantly thinking about the struggles that our world is facing. Like it's on my mind all the time. Issues and challenges that families are facing, things that are happening in the community, both on a spiritual level, an emotional level, a psychological level. Just constantly thinking about these things, and what does it look like for us to solve some of these really, really, really hard issues when people are filled with so much anger and hatred, and there's so much ignorance and blindness, and the conclusion that I find myself coming to every time, all the time, is nobody but you, God. Like nobody but you. No, nobody. There is nobody on earth that can um, really fix the stuff that we're dealing with. Um, Nobody but God. It's not to say that we don't have a role to play. It's not saying that we shouldn't actively be, again, walking humbly with our gods, doing justice, seeking and doing mercy. Um, but it is to say that there are limits to our power to fix the stuff that ails the souls of men and women. And if God won't do it, can't do it, then it can't be done. And so in this season, um, increasingly, I find that my conviction is to lean into the things of God, to pursue Him with all my heart, my mind, my soul, and my strength, and to love my neighbor as myself. To seek first the kingdom of God and all of its righteousness, and trust God to deal with the details of my life and the things that are happening in the community around me. And my prayer is that God would continue to surround me, connect me with like-minded men and women um, who love God, love His appearing, and want to pursue Him with everything that they have, to trust God with the details of what we're dealing with, and know that He is faithful and that He is able. That's my prayer for you. My prayer is that you would continue to make your way to Shiloh, wherever your Shiloh may be. If your Shiloh is New Hope, 2120 19th Street South, then I want to encourage you to continue to show up to Shiloh. But wherever your Shiloh is, let us continue to seek the face of the Lord with those who love God, who love His appearing. Listen, we love you. We bless God. I pray that our sharing of Hannah's story tonight was an encouragement to you, and that you would continue in your own way to cry out to God and know that He is a God um, who hears and answers prayer. We love you.